The morning air in the Colorado foothills tasted like freedom, sharp pine, cold earth, and the faint sweetness of the cedar I'd used for my cabin walls. My coffee steamed in the chill, curling tendrils of warmth into my nose as I stood in my hand-built workshop. The place was new, but it already felt like home. That's when I saw it. A thick, official-looking envelope sat on my kitchen counter, its certified mail stamp glaring at me like a red warning light. I tore it open expecting maybe some tax paperwork. Instead, I got this: fine issued in the amount of $30,000 for construction of an unauthorized structure in violation of community covenants. I had to read it twice. My cabin, apparently violated HOA rules. Which would have been hilarious if it wasn't so outrageous. Because my cabin sat a good 847 feet outside of HOA property. At first, I figured it had to be a clerical error. They'd mixed up addresses or pulled the wrong file. No big deal. But then I saw the signature. Vivian Hartwell, President, Pine Ridge Estates HOA. I knew her. Everybody knew her. Vivian was the kind of woman who introduced herself with her title first, like it was royalty. HOA Board President Vivian Hartwell, she'd say, in that clipped corporate tone that made "Have a blessed day" sound like a threat. She'd ruled our HOA for years, 5 board members under her thumb, every mailbox painted the same shade of forest green number 17, every fence exactly 6 feet tall. She even carried a tape measure in her purse. I'd once seen her measure a neighbor's garden gnome to see if it violated height restrictions. I didn't think much of her, but I also didn't think she had anything to do with me anymore. My property was outside Pine Ridge Estates. I'd inherited the land from my Uncle Ray, 40 acres of pine forest, deer trails, and solitude. It sat just beyond the last HOA street sign, untouched by their endless rules. When I decided to build the cabin, I'd done everything right. 30 years as a union electrician taught me the value of permits. I'd gone straight to the county office, filed every piece of paperwork, structural, electrical, septic. The yellow permit placards were nailed proudly to a pine tree at the edge of the build site. My little 600-square-foot retreat was legal as Sunday morning church bells. But according to this letter, none of that mattered. The paper felt heavier in my hand the longer I stared at it. A $30,000 fine. For a cabin that wasn't even on their land. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing my late wife Melody's voice in my head. She'd loved this kind of mountain quiet, the sound of wind in the trees. She'd tell me to stand my ground. She'd say, "Don't let bullies push you around, Garrett." By morning, I decided to handle it neighbor to neighbor. I called her. "Mrs. Hartwell, this is Garrett Steele. I think there's been a mistake. My cabin's outside HOA boundaries." A long pause. I could hear paper shuffling. "Mr. Steele," she said, her voice sticky sweet, "our jurisdiction extends to all member properties regardless of their specific location. The covenants are clear on this matter. With respect, ma'am, I've got county permits showing." "I'm sure you do," she cut me off. "However, our legal counsel has reviewed the situation. The fine stands. Good day." Click. I stared at the dead phone line, half expecting her to call back and say it was all a misunderstanding. She didn't. 2 weeks later, I realized this wasn't a mistake. This was war. It started small. An anonymous complaint to the county about my illegal rental property. Rumors at the grocery store about me losing it after my wife's passing. Neighbors suddenly watching me whenever I drove toward the cabin site, phones out like paparazzi. The fine wasn't the end. It was just the opening move. That's when I learned something important about bullies. They count on you being too tired to fight back. They counted wrong. By the time winter frost glazed the edges of my porch, Vivian's campaign had gone from irritating to relentless. It started with the county inspector, who drove all the way out to my cabin after receiving a credible tip that I was running an unlicensed vacation rental. The man spent 20 minutes poking around before shrugging and telling me, "Looks fine to me, Mr. Steele. Someone's wasting my time." Next came the whispers. At the hardware store, two neighbors stopped talking the second I walked in. At the grocery store, a woman I'd known for years avoided eye contact while murmuring to her friend, "Poor man's not thinking straight since Melody passed." Every lumber delivery I received for the cabin was suddenly met with curious onlookers hiding behind trees or pretending to walk their dogs, phones out, snapping photos like I was a zoo animal. Vivian had turned my life into a fishbowl. I tried ignoring it. I really did. But the breaking point came on a cold Thursday morning when her white Lexus pulled into my driveway. She stepped out in designer heels that immediately sank into the dirt, clipboard in hand and that trademark tight-lipped smile plastered on her face. "Garrett," she said, like we were old friends discussing weather patterns. "Perhaps we can come to an arrangement." "I'm listening," I said, though my voice was ice. "If you halt construction immediately and remove the existing structure, we might consider reducing the fine to a more manageable amount. Let's say, $5,000. For administrative inconvenience." I stared at her, coffee cooling in my hand. She was offering to reduce a completely fabricated fine by 83%, as if I'd thank her for the discount. That's when something in me shifted. "You know, Mrs. Hartwell," I said slowly, "I think it's time I did some research of my own." Her smile flickered like a bad light bulb. "Research? Property records? Survey maps? Maybe even those original HOA documents you keep mentioning?" For the first time, she didn't have a quick reply. She just tightened her grip on the clipboard and walked back to her car without another word. The next morning, I was at the Jefferson County Courthouse. If 30 years of construction work taught me anything, it's that bureaucrats may move slow, but their paper trails are precise. Property lines, easements, covenants, all neatly filed and stamped in triplicate. I started with the incorporation documents for Pine Ridge Estates. Turned out HOA boundaries weren't a vague, community spirit thing. They were mapped and recorded, just like city limits. That's when I hit the first jackpot. My Uncle Ray's 40 acres had been deeded and recorded 15 years before Pine Ridge Estates even existed. In legal terms, the land was grandfathered, immune to later HOA rules. The second jackpot was buried in the HOA's own covenant paperwork. Section 12, subsection C, paragraph 4, the association's authority extends only to properties within the platted boundaries recorded with Jefferson County as of March 15, 2008. I read it 3 times. My cabin wasn't just outside their reach, it was legally impossible for them to have jurisdiction. The next step was obvious: get a professional survey. That's where I met Rex Morrison, 62 years old, sun-browned, and with the weary patience of a man who'd spent 4 decades arguing with property lines. "Let me guess," he said as he unloaded his gear. "HOA thinks they own whatever they can see from their front gates." "Something like that," I said. "Seen it before. GPS doesn't lie. Neither does a proper survey." For 3 hours, Rex worked with quiet precision, the morning mist curling around his scope. When he finished, he pulled a printout from his case, tapped the coordinates, and grinned. 847 feet, he said. "You're well outside their boundary. No gray area. No wiggle room." It was the confirmation I'd been waiting for. That afternoon, I sent certified copies of Rex's survey to every member of the HOA board, along with a polite letter requesting that they withdraw the fine and issue a written apology. Vivian's reply came 48 hours later. Surveyor error. Fine stands. Pay immediately or face property lien. It hit me harder than the original fine. This wasn't about property lines anymore. This was about power. And if she was willing to put a lien on my home, the place Melody and I had built together over 3 decades, then this wasn't just an HOA dispute. This was personal. The envelope was heavy. Not because of weight, but because of what it carried. Inside was a single-page notice, stamped in thick red ink, notice of intent to lien. Vivian hadn't wasted time. According to the letter, I had 14 days to pay the $30,000 violation penalty, or Pine Ridge Estates would initiate a lien against my property, a move that could eventually force a sale if unpaid. I read it twice. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh. Almost. But underneath the anger, a darker feeling crept in, the realization that she was escalating, not backing down. A lien meant lawyers. Legal fees. Months of stress. It also meant Vivian believed she was untouchable. That night, I pulled every dusty file box from the loft above my garage. Old tax returns, deed copies, my Uncle Ray's hand-sketched maps, anything that could serve as proof. In the middle of the mess, I found a plastic folder labeled simply, HOA, 2008. Inside were flyers from when Pine Ridge Estates first formed. Their promises had been sweet back then: community gardens, walking trails, an annual barbecue. My uncle had tossed the mailer aside, grumbling, "Bunch of busybodies. Don't sign nothin', dot." He never had. Which meant, by law, neither had I. Still, Vivian's aggression didn't add up. She had to know about the survey. She had to realize any lawyer worth their salt would toss her claim out before lunch. Unless, the fight wasn't about me at all. The next morning, I called up my old friend Eddie Ramos, retired cop, part-time private investigator. We'd worked side by side on a few renovation jobs, and I knew he still had the knack for sniffing out trouble. Run a background on Pine Ridge Estates, I told him. The board, the finances, the works. He chuckled. Sounds like you're planning something. I'm planning to win. While Eddie dug, I paid a visit to a couple of other folks in Vivian's crosshairs. First was Carl, a wiry man in his 70s who'd lived here longer than anyone. His sin? Building a shed without prior aesthetic review. The HOA fined him $1,200 and threatened daily penalties until he painted it community beige. Then there was Janice, a young mother of 2 who got slapped with a $500 fine for leaving her kids' bikes in the driveway overnight. She'd cried telling me about it, not just the money, but the humiliation of being singled out in the monthly newsletter's violations section. Different stories, same pattern. Vivian's HOA ruled with an iron fist, inventing rules as they went. And people paid, because fighting back cost more than giving in. 3 days later, Eddie called me back. "Garrett," he said, voice low, "you might want to sit down." He'd gotten his hands on the HOA's financial statements. Or at least, what passed for them, sloppy spreadsheets with half the entries labeled only miscellaneous expense. One line item stood out, $47,300, Playground Improvements Fund. Problem was, there was no new playground. In fact, the old one had been torn down last summer for safety reasons, and never replaced. "That money's gone," Eddie said flatly. And I'd bet my pension it didn't vanish by accident. It clicked like the last piece in a puzzle. My fine wasn't just a power move, it was a cash grab. Vivian was trying to fill a hole in the books before anyone noticed. And if I could prove that, I wouldn't just beat the lien. I'd take her down. I started planning my next move. Step 1, get the neighbors talking. I knew fear kept them quiet, but money had a way of changing priorities, especially missing money. Step 2. Force the board into a public setting where Vivian couldn't hide behind letters and threats. Lucky for me, HOA bylaws had a little gem buried in Section 4. If 25% of members petitioned for a special meeting, the board was legally required to hold it within 30 days. All I needed were signatures. The next week became a blur of porch visits, whispered conversations, and careful explanations of the missing $47,300. Some slammed doors in my face, too afraid to get involved. Others signed immediately, their pens pressing so hard the ink bled through the paper. By Friday, I had 32% of the neighborhood, enough to trigger the meeting. I sent the petition via certified mail, return receipt requested. Vivian signed for it herself. 2 days later, the HOA notice went out, emergency general meeting, mandatory attendance. Good. She'd have no choice but to face everyone. I was ready. Or so I thought. Because the night before the meeting, I found something in my mailbox that changed everything. The envelope in my mailbox wasn't the usual HOA stationery. It was old, yellowed, and sealed with a strip of Scotch tape so brittle it cracked when I peeled it back. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, folded into quarters. The handwriting was shaky, but the words were sharp enough to cut. They've done this before. Don't let them scare you. J. There was no return address, no last name. Just that cryptic warning. At first, I figured J was one of the folks who'd signed my petition. But the more I thought about it, the more I wondered what "done this before" really meant. The morning of the meeting, I decided to find out. I started knocking on doors again, not to gather signatures this time, but to gather stories. And the stories came. Carl, the shed guy, told me his fine had ballooned from $1,200 to nearly $4,000 because the board kept adding administrative fees every month. He'd ended up paying just to stop the threats. Janice, the bike mom, revealed she tried to fight her fine in small claims court, until the HOA hit her with a counterclaim for legal expenses that could have bankrupted her. She dropped the case immediately. Then came Mrs. Hanley, a soft-spoken widow who lived near the pond. She invited me in, made tea, and slid a manila folder across the table. Inside were copies of bank statements, court filings, and letters dating back almost 10 years. Her late husband had been the HOA treasurer before Vivian took over. According to her, the board had reallocated $15,000 from the landscaping budget to a community improvements account, which mysteriously emptied in less than 3 months. When her husband raised questions, he was ousted from the board in a closed-door vote. He started getting letters, just like you, she said, her hands tightening around the teacup. Threats about liens, violations we'd never heard of. It wore him down. I asked if she'd be willing to speak at the meeting. She shook her head. They'll twist it. They always do. By noon, my notebook was thick with accounts of harassment, bullying, and financial sleight of hand. But none of it was hard proof, just memories, fears, and paper trails that hinted more than they proved. I needed something undeniable. Something that would make the room turn on Vivian before she could spin the narrative. That's when Eddie called again. Got another present for you, he said. You're gonna like this one. He'd dug deeper into the HOA's tax filings. The latest report listed playground improvements as a completed project. Not pending, not budgeted, completed. Which meant someone had officially certified that the $47,300 had been spent for its intended purpose. That's fraud, I said. Bingo. And if you bring that up in front of witnesses, Eddie let the thought hang in the air. By 6 p.m., the community center parking lot was jammed. Pickup trucks, SUVs, even a couple of golf carts. People who never came to meetings were filing inside, curiosity outweighing fear for the first time. Vivian was already at the front, flanked by two board members in matching polo shirts with the HOA logo embroidered over the heart. She wore a crimson blazer, power dressing at its most obvious, and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The moment I walked in, her gaze locked on me. Cold. Calculating. "Mr. Steele," she said into the microphone, her voice syrupy with false politeness, "thank you for finally joining us in an official capacity. Perhaps we can resolve your outstanding issue tonight." I didn't answer. I just took a seat in the front row and set my folder on my lap. I wanted her to see it. The meeting began with the usual formalities: approval of last month's minutes, budget updates, committee reports. Vivian tried to keep it brisk, clearly hoping to get through before anyone asked the wrong questions. But then she got to new business. "Mr. Steele has requested time to address the board," she said, the fake smile returning. "We will allow 5 minutes." I stood, taking the microphone from her hand. "5 minutes will do," I said. I opened my folder, pulled out the tax filing, and held it up for everyone to see. "This," I said, "is the HOA's official report to the state. It says we spent $47,300 on playground improvements last year. As you all know," I paused, letting the silence stretch. "There is no playground." A ripple of murmurs swept through the room. Vivian's smile twitched. "And that's not the only number that doesn't add up." I laid the paper on the table in front of her. "Let's talk about where the money really went." The room went dead quiet, the silence after my last words was thick enough to feel. You could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights above us. Vivian glanced at the two board members flanking her. They didn't look back, they were staring at the paper in front of her like it was a live grenade. "This is an accounting error," she finally said, her voice tight. "The funds were reallocated for what?" I cut in. "Because the report says playground improvements and lists the project as complete. That's a certification under penalty of law. So unless there's a playground hidden in your garage, this is a problem." A few people in the back snorted. Someone else muttered, "Fraud." Vivian's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Steele, you have no authority to accuse this board." I stepped forward, closing the gap between us until we were separated only by the folding table. "I'm not accusing. I'm asking. And I think everyone here deserves an answer." The room started to shift, literally. People leaned forward, murmuring, looking from me to Vivian like they were watching a match they didn't expect to get this interesting. And then Eddie, bless his timing, stood up in the back row. "I used to work in compliance for a construction firm," he said. "And I've reviewed the same filings Garrett's talking about. If this was submitted to the state with false information, we're not talking about an accounting error. We're talking about criminal fraud." Gasps. Actual, audible gasps. Vivian's face flushed crimson. "This is outrageous." "No," Eddie said, "what's outrageous is that you've been fining people thousands of dollars for flower pots while misreporting nearly 50 grand of community funds." It was like a dam breaking. Carl from the shed incident raised his hand and didn't wait to be called on. My fine doubled every month without explanation. I paid just to stop the threats. Where'd that money go? Janice, the mom whose kids' bikes had been targeted, stood up. "You tried to fine me over $200 for a chalk drawing. I'm still waiting for my appeal hearing, it's been 14 months. Where's the accountability?" Vivian tried to bang her gavel, but the sound was drowned out by a growing rumble of voices. "This meeting is out of order," she declared. "We will reconvene at a later date." "Not so fast," a new voice said. I turned to see an older woman making her way down the aisle. She walked with a cane, but her presence was commanding. I recognized her immediately, Mrs. Hanley, the widow who had shown me her late husband's files. She reached the table, set down a thick manila envelope, and addressed the room without even looking at Vivian. "My husband was treasurer here before this woman took over," she said, tapping her cane once for emphasis. "We kept meticulous records. And when he questioned a $15,000 disappearance from the landscaping budget, he was removed in a secret vote. I have the minutes. I have the bank statements. And now, so do several members of the state auditor's office." You could have heard a pin drop. Vivian's mouth opened, then closed. She looked like someone had just pulled the floor out from under her. "Garrett," Mrs. Hanley said, turning to me, "you were right to fight. But you're not the only one she's done this to." That's when I knew, really knew, that we had her. "Motion to remove Vivian Hartwell as HOA president," Eddie said loudly. "Seconded," Mrs. Hanley replied. Vivian slammed the gavel down so hard it nearly broke. "You can't do this. This isn't a properly scheduled." "Yes, we can," Eddie said, holding up the HOA bylaws he'd printed. Section 4.3, special votes may be called if a majority of members present agree. And judging by the show of hands, hands shot up across the room. Dozens. Then more. Vivian's eyes darted around, looking for support, but even her own board members kept their arms folded. When the count was done, the vote wasn't even close. Vivian Hartwell was officially removed as president of the Cedar Pines Homeowners Association. She tried to storm out, but before she could, a man in a dark suit appeared at the doorway. He flashed a badge and stepped forward. "Vivian Hartwell," he said. "State Auditor's Office. We need to have a word." The entire room went dead quiet again. I leaned back in my chair, watching her freeze. This, I thought, was just the beginning. Vivian was led out of the meeting room with two auditors flanking her like silent shadows. No cuffs yet, this wasn't an arrest. Not yet. But the way her spine stiffened and her hands twitched told me she knew she was in real trouble. As soon as the door shut, the room erupted into cheers, clapping, and more than a few relieved sighs. It felt like oxygen was finally back in the air. But Eddie leaned toward me and whispered, "We're not done. If there's been fraud for years, there's more money unaccounted for than just that playground fund." That's when I remembered Josephine. Josephine lived 3 houses down from me, a quiet woman in her late 70s with sharp eyes and a sharper memory. She'd been here long before Vivian's reign. When I'd first started poking into the HOA's finances weeks ago, Josephine had invited me over for tea. On her kitchen table had been a dusty, oversized cardboard box with HOA, Keep, scrawled on the side in black marker. She'd told me she'd been the HOA secretary for 5 years and kept copies of everything. "Someday," she'd said with a knowing smile, "someone will need these." At the time, I hadn't looked through them all. But now was the time. That night, I knocked on her door. "Ah, Garrett," she said, as if she'd been expecting me. "I heard about the meeting." She stepped aside, motioning for me to come in. The box was already waiting on the table. "Go on," she said. "Let's see what the Queen's been hiding." I pulled out folders thick with paper, meeting minutes, old budgets, invoices from contractors. It was like stepping into a time capsule. And then I saw it, a series of annual financial statements, each signed by Vivian Hartwell herself, spanning her entire presidency. The problem? The income and expense lines didn't match the official HOA reports I'd gotten from the current treasurer. Not even close. For example, in 2019, there was a line item, community beautification, $47,000. According to these internal records, the money had been spent on retaining wall repairs. But there was no retaining wall in Cedar Pines. I flipped through more files. Year after year, similar discrepancies popped up. Landscaping invoices from companies that didn't exist. Repairs to amenities we never had. Even security upgrades for the clubhouse, which was just an empty storage shed with a leaky roof. It was blatant. And it was big. Eddie came over to help cross-reference the documents with the HOA's bank statements we'd already obtained from the auditor. The missing money added up to over $200,000 across 6 years. By midnight, we had a neat stack of the most damning documents. Josephine poured us coffee and watched quietly. I kept quiet because, well, Vivian could be vicious, she said. She made people's lives miserable. But you have the teeth for this. I smiled at that, even though my stomach was still in knots. This wasn't just a corrupt president. This was organized theft. The next morning, Eddie and I walked into the state auditor's satellite office with Josephine's box. The investigator assigned to the HOA case, a tall, stone-faced man named Randall, took one look at the records and whistled. "This," he said, "is exactly what we needed. Thank you." He explained that with this level of documentation, they could pursue not just a financial audit but a criminal embezzlement case. Vivian could be looking at years in prison. I didn't feel bad for her. Not even a little. Word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. People who had been too scared to speak before started coming forward with their own stories, fines that mysteriously doubled, required repairs they were billed for but never received, promises of projects that vanished without explanation. The picture became clearer every day. Vivian had run the HOA like her personal cash register. A week later, Randall called me. "They're moving fast," he said. "She's under formal investigation. And, Garrett, one of those fake invoices you found. It was billed to a company owned by her cousin. That's where the $47,000 went. We can prove it." I hung up, grinning. The Queen's castle wasn't just crumbling, it was being bulldozed. But as satisfying as it was, there was still one final thing to do. The lien on my cabin, the whole reason this started, was still technically active. And I wasn't going to rest until I saw it vanish in black and white. That, I decided, would be my victory lap. The morning of the lien hearing, the air outside the county courthouse was heavy with the smell of rain. I stood under the gray sky, file folder in hand, watching the storm clouds roll in. Inside that folder was every scrap of evidence the auditors had gathered, the fraudulent invoices, the missing $47,000 from the retaining wall repairs, and Josephine's original meeting minutes that contradicted Vivian's official records. It wasn't just my defense. It was a weapon. The hearing room was small, lined with dull wood paneling and a single humming ceiling fan. On one side of the table sat my attorney, Eddie, and me. On the other side was Vivian, in a beige suit that looked like it had been pulled from the back of her closet. She didn't have her usual smug smile. Her hair wasn't perfectly coiffed. The skin around her eyes was puffy, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked tired. The county official presiding over the hearing adjusted his glasses and began. Vivian's lawyer made the first move, claiming the lien was properly filed under HOA bylaws and that I had failed to seek architectural approval for my cabin repairs. Eddie slid the first packet across the table, copies of the actual HOA architectural approval I'd received months before the repairs began, complete with Vivian's signature. The official studied the papers, then turned his eyes to Vivian. Her lips pressed together so tightly they went white. Then Eddie brought out the second set of documents, the forensic audit results showing the HOA had been under investigation for financial misconduct, and that Vivian was the primary person of interest. The county official leaned back in his chair, eyebrows raised. "Mrs. Hartwell, are you aware that misuse of association funds can nullify certain enforcement actions taken under your leadership?" Vivian's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Vivian's eyes darted toward the door. When Josephine entered the room as our surprise witness, Vivian's jaw nearly hit the table. "Mrs. Hartwell," Josephine said, her voice calm and even, "I served as HOA secretary for 5 years before you took over. I've kept records of every meeting, every budget, and every vote. I can confirm that Garrett Steele's cabin repairs were never in violation of HOA rules. What was in violation," she continued, "was your handling of the HOA's finances." The room went quiet except for the faint tick of the wall clock. The county official took a deep breath, flipped through his notes, and finally said, "Based on the evidence provided, this lien is invalid. It will be removed from the property title effective immediately." It took me a second to register the words. But when I did, my shoulders dropped, and I felt a weight I'd been carrying for months finally lift. Vivian's lawyer closed his folder and muttered something under his breath. Vivian stared at me, her eyes burning with a mix of anger and humiliation. I gave her a polite smile. "Guess we're done here." 2 weeks later, the neighborhood woke to the news. Vivian Hartwell had been arrested on charges of embezzlement, fraud, and falsifying financial records. The photo of her in the local paper, hair messy, eyes hollow, wearing an orange jumpsuit, was a far cry from the queen-like figure who used to rule Cedar Pines. She faced up to 10 years in prison. At the next HOA meeting, without Vivian's looming presence, the atmosphere was lighter. People laughed. Neighbors who had avoided each other for years shook hands. We voted in a new president, Josephine, and began talking about real improvements we could actually afford. And yes, we even funded that playground. This time, the money stayed exactly where it was supposed to. One evening, months later, I sat on my repaired porch with a cup of coffee, looking out at the pine trees swaying in the breeze. The lien was gone, the HOA was honest again, and the cabin finally felt like home. Eddie stopped by, leaning against the railing. "You know," he said, "most people would have just paid the fine and walked away." I smirked. Most people don't have a box like Josephine's, or a reason to burn the whole rotten tree down. We clinked coffee mugs. The storm was over. And I'd won. That closes all 7 parts, each with drama, pacing, and cliffhangers, ending in a complete, satisfying win for Garrett. Do you also want me to prepare image prompts plus tags for each part so this can be turned into a fully illustrated series?